In Dark Money, award-winning journalist Jane Mayer describes how the wealthy elite in America, particularly conservative business tycoons Charles and David Koch, used their fortunes to propagate far-right ideology in American politics between the 1970s and 2016. Under the guise of philanthropy, they created a massive political network that effectively shifted American politics from center-left to the right and infused the culture and government with the previously fringe beliefs of libertarianism and free market capitalism. Mayer has won several awards for her work for The New Yorker, including the John Chancellor Award and the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting. She is the author of The Dark Side, which also won multiple awards including the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize and the Right in Our Prize. In our guide, we'll explore how Charles and David Koch developed their ideas about free market capitalism, how they and their donors used their vast wealth to transform these ideas from a fringe to mainstream movement, and how they used that movement to wield disproportionate influence over American politics to protect and grow their wealth. We'll also examine the historical, social, and political contexts of the book's events, and how they have impacted society today. New section: The Koch brothers, Inheriting Free Market Beliefs. According to Mayer, the Koch brothers' political beliefs were influenced heavily by those of their father, Fred Koch, 1900 to 1967. Fred was a businessman who distrusted government and was strongly in favor of free markets. He made a fortune building oil refineries in Russia under Joseph Stalin's regime, as well as building a huge refinery in Germany during the Third Reich. This refinery produced the fuel needed by fighter planes, providing an essential piece of the Nazis' warfaring capabilities. Short-form note: Fred Koch was not the only wealthy American industrialist to contribute to the Nazis' war machine. Historical records show that the car companies Ford, General Motors, and Opel produced military vehicles, and even warplanes for the Nazis, and some of their German subsidiaries used forced labor in their production lines. IBM also produced machines and materials essential to the Nazi regime. Experts suggest that American companies' facilitation of the Holocaust indicates that free market capitalism, like the kind Fred Koch taught his sons to believe in, is economically efficient, but inherently prone to immorality and lack of accountability. Later, explains Mayer, Fred became one of the first members of the John Birch Society, a far-right group that promoted conspiracy theories that communists were trying to overthrow America. Among other extreme views, Koch believed and wrote that communists had infiltrated American politics, were conspiring with black people to start a race war, and that desegregation was part of that war. Short-form note: while the John Birch Society's influence and membership dwindled during the second half of the 20th century, experts have noted that it's made a resurgence in recent years. They suggest that the society, long known for its paranoid conspiracy theories, is made of the same far-right extremism as the QAnon movement, which fueled the deadly attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. According to Mayer, Fred Koch set up a charitable lead trust, so he could avoid inheritance taxes when passing on his fortune to his sons. Such a trust allowed someone to pass on their wealth to their children tax-free, as long as the interest accrued on that wealth went to charity for a set amount of time, in the case of Fred Koch's trust, 20 years. However, a charity could be defined broadly and could include donations to the subject's private foundations. This way, they could avoid taxes and control what was done with the money they donated while also appearing to the public as generous philanthropists. Short-form note: many of the wealthy elite use philanthropy to maintain a positive public image, but critics object that their philanthropy might exacerbate the societal problems they appear to be trying to fix, resulting in a net loss for society. The past 2 decades have seen a massive increase in philanthropic giving, but experts note that this has not correlated with a decrease in economic inequality. Rather, it seems to reinforce inequality and benefit the rich, as the majority of charitable donations go to universities and other institutions that are already wealthy, while the poor continue to be neglected. This was also the case with Fred Koch's charitable lead trust that only benefited his sons, and let them avoid taxes that could have gone toward public works. Many billionaires shared Koch's views, opposing taxes, especially income and estate taxes, which have a heavier impact on the wealthy than on the poor, and claiming it was unfair in principle for the wealthy to pay a greater share than the poor. At the same time, they took full advantage of things like tax credits and government subsidies, which they claimed to oppose. Short-form note: the majority of Americans disagree with the Koch's attitude toward taxes, and instead feel that the ultra-wealthy should be taxed more than they currently are. Some members of the rich also believe they should be taxed more heavily. In light of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has widened the gap between the rich and the poor, groups like Billionaires for Humanity have called for a global wealth tax on the super-rich, noting that a progressive tax of just 2 to 5% on the wealthy could provide over $2.5 trillion per year. New section: Building a Movement. According to Mayer, Charles took an interest in spreading these beliefs to others. In the 1960s he became involved with funding and running a school called the Freedom School, later expanded into Rampart College, which taught that taxation was theft, that government should be almost entirely abolished, and that the Civil War should never have been fought because people should have the right to sell themselves into slavery if they wanted to, among other far-right beliefs. Short-form note: the Freedom School began as a single-course program on a campus in Colorado before being expanded into Rampart College and later revived as Rampart Institute. Now, Charles Koch is continuing to fund freedom schools at institutions like Arizona State University and the University of Arizona. The curricula at these freedom schools are also based on libertarian thought, as at the previous iterations of such centers. Charles and David began passionately championing libertarianism, which, at the time, was a fringe belief, explains Mayer. In 1976 Charles funded the Center for Libertarian Studies in New York City, where a conference was held that featured several high-profile libertarian figures. These figures, Charles included, wrote a number of papers calling for a concerted effort by the wealthy to propagate libertarianism among both politicians and the citizenry. They recommended inventing fake grassroots movements, courting media figures to create a positive public image, and targeting America's youth, since they would be more open to new ideas. One speaker even suggested following the Nazis' lead in this regard, saying they were able to successfully take over the country because of the youth movement they started. Short-form note: the approach Charles and the other libertarians took was appealing because of its great success in Nazi Germany. In particular, the targeting of young people in Nazi Germany proved to be highly effective in indoctrinating children into Nazi ideology. Though it had only 50,000 members in 1933, by 1939 the Hitler Youth included over 90% of the children in Germany. The effects of that indoctrination are visible today, as research shows that anti-Semitism is still much higher in Germans raised during the Third Reich than those who were raised before or after it. They further advised funding private institutions at highly respected universities so donors could control things like staffing decisions and curricula. Additionally, the speakers, particularly Charles Koch, strongly recommended that these actions be done in secrecy to avoid criticism, a tactic inspired by the John Birch Society. This conference began the creation of a vast donor network of America's wealthy elite dedicated to the proliferation of far-right beliefs. Short-form note: while the Kochs and their donors set out to turn higher education into a pipeline for conservative-minded thinkers, today many conservatives argue that higher education is actually a hotbed for liberal indoctrination. However, research suggests that people's political views don't change much between the time they enter college and the time they leave, indicating that higher education has little effect on students' overall political leanings. Funneling dark money, partisanship and think tanks. From the beginning, explains Mayer, the wealthy had to circumvent campaign finance laws and regulations on lobbying groups in order to keep their political spending secret and to continue to enjoy the tax-exempt status of their foundations. Money spent in this way is known as dark money. Groups such as the American Enterprise Institute in the mid-20th century directed their efforts into political lobbying but faced criticism from the government, which threatened their tax-deductible status. This led them to make an effort to avoid appearing partisan until the 1970s. What is the purpose of lobbying? Lobbying exists to help individual citizens influence the actions of a democratically elected government. Since it's impossible for every single voice in a nation to reach their elected officials, lobbying groups are intended to consolidate interests that are important to citizens and bring these issues to the attention of the government. Corporate lobbying, which became common during the 1970s and has continuously expanded in the decades since, represents the interests of corporations, not necessarily those of individuals, and their access to ample funding gives them disproportionate influence over the government compared to other public interest groups. In the same way, lobbying groups run by the wealthy, such as the American Enterprise Institute, also have an outsized influence on political decisions. However, in the 1970s, conservatives began redefining what partisanship looked like by portraying well-known nonpartisan news outlets like the New York Times as distinctly liberal and claiming they were just providing a counterpoint to those ideas. This not only made conservative think tanks appear less biased, explains Mayer, but it pushed these previously independent news sources further right as these groups scrambled to add conservatives to their ranks to appear less biased. Short-form note: while the New York Times generally continues to have a liberal bent in its official reporting, the outlet has hired numerous conservative opinion columnists, some of whom have been criticized for misrepresenting their interests and affiliations, using faulty logic, and cherry-picking sources. Critics suggest that the outlet's attempt to add diversity of ideas favors the far right and neglects the far left. This shift of the entire political climate to the right made the far-right ideas of free market capitalism and libertarianism more mainstream. The wealthy also began funding biased, and even fraudulent academic and scientific research through think tanks that supported their political agendas, allowing them to curate the spread of ideas to suit their corporate interests. Short-form note: the purpose of think tanks is to push for social change using evidence-based research and ideas. Members of these groups conduct research and present ideas to politicians for consideration in their policies. However, critics point out that many of the groups are staffed by lobbyists or people who are employed by corporations with vested interests in the research the think tanks are conducting. These individuals are able to influence policy decisions with the assumed credibility of scholars, and without having to disclose their potential conflicts of interest, and much of their research is industry-sponsored and biased. This may contribute to the negative view of think tanks that many people hold. New section: Catalysts, the factors leading to the Koch's political involvement. Prior to 1970, explains Mayer, the Kochs had been focused more on spreading free market ideas to the public and in academia. However, clashes with the government and the legal system led them to seek ways to use their power to directly influence the political sphere. One of the biggest motivating factors for the Kochs, and many others in their donor network, was the new environmental and labor regulations put in place by acts like the Clean Air Act and the Toxic Substances Control Act, as well as the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, in 1970. According to Mayer, corporations were disturbed by these groups' actions and their potential harm to industrial profits. These regulations posed a threat to the fortunes of many in the Koch's circle, including those in the tobacco and fossil fuel industry. Some corporations, including Koch Industries, found themselves facing legal issues as a result of their practices. During these cases, the Kochs established what appeared to be a pattern of spying on and intimidating their legal opponents. Short-form note: we can see the Kochs' concern for their bottom line as part of a broader trend in business of prioritizing profits over human well-being. For example, reviews of previously confidential documents show that fossil fuel companies engaged in toxic chemicals research with the explicit goal of protecting corporate interests, using research methods that were questionable at best. Documents further show that they actively suppressed research that showed the dangers of toxic chemicals that would be damaging to their corporate profits. Some of the lawsuits the Kochs faced related to their handling of benzene, a carcinogen that could cause leukemia. Koch Industries came under fire for failing to notify at least one employee, Donald Carlson, of abnormal results in his blood tests which OSHA mandated they give to any employee exposed to benzene. Carlson became too sick to work and was fired by the company and given 6 months severance pay. A few years later he died of leukemia at age 53. A whistleblower also revealed that Koch Industries was exceeding the legal limit on benzene emissions by a factor of 15, and were doctoring reports to hide this fact. The whistleblower was allegedly harassed by the company in retaliation. Short-form note: the few years that Carlson was not informed of his abnormal test results may have had a deadly impact. Research shows that early detection of cancer greatly improves survival rates, suggesting that an earlier diagnosis may have saved or at least extended Carlson's life. Even so, the legal limits on benzene may be insufficient for protecting the health of those who work with the chemical. Current OSHA standards limit the amount of benzene an employee can be exposed to 5 ppm, parts per million, over 15 minutes, or 1 ppm over 8 hours. However, a 2004 study indicates that there is no amount of benzene exposure that can be considered safe. Another employee who tried to alert his supervisors to the careless disposal of mercury which employees were instructed to dispose of by pouring it in dumpsters or down the sink was intimidated by a person claiming to be from the FBI and threatened with termination if he didn't recant his allegations. According to Mayer, this person was later identified not as an FBI agent but as a member of the coke industry's security. Over the years, there were numerous other lawsuits filed against Koch Industries over their handling of toxic chemicals, their maintenance of underground pipelines, and their theft of oil from tribal land owned by Native Americans, among other things. Several individuals involved in these cases found themselves being spied on, including a lawyer whose office was bugged and an FBI agent who was tailed by a man who claimed to have been hired by Koch Industries. A member of the Senate's investigative committee into Koch Industries' illegal practices compared investigating the Kochs to investigating organized crime rather than a legitimate business. Short-form note: the use of corporate intimidation to suppress criticism has continued to grow over the past decades. These intimidation tactics include the threat of lawsuits, the costs of which are much more manageable for the corporations than for the individuals or groups they're brought against. In other countries where American corporations operate, there has been a high rate of intimidation, and even murder of people speaking out against harmful environmental and labor practices. An outcry against this violence is again often silenced through legal action designed to financially ruin opponents. These suits were heavily damaging to Koch Industries' public image, but Charles Koch didn't feel the company needed to change its practices. Rather, he felt that the problem was the legal system itself, and these suits prompted him to strive to create a purely free market economy without any of the regulations that were causing his company's problems. Are the Kochs' practices really based on libertarian principles? While the Kochs' handling of an opposition to environmental and labor regulations was done in the name of the free market, critics may argue that their behavior was inconsistent with libertarian values. Libertarianism promotes the idea that all individuals should be able to pursue their unique interests, but only on the condition that they do not infringe on the rights, especially the property rights of others. Some libertarian thinkers suggest that contributing to climate change does infringe on the rights of others, though there is disagreement about whether this should be corrected by regulations like pollution taxes or by increasing individual ownership of natural resources, thus incentivizing individuals to protect the environment. New section: Taking Over American Politics, Richard Fink's Plan. While the Kochs felt motivated to enter politics, they struggled to gain traction. In 1980, David Koch ran for vice president on the Libertarian ticket on a platform that mirrored the Freedom School's curriculum. It called for the abolition of Medicare, Social Security, the EPA, income tax, child labor laws, public education, and essentially every government service except the enforcement of property laws. The campaign failed, receiving just 1% of the vote. Short-form note: the Libertarian Party is currently the third largest political party in America. However, the Democratic and Republican parties still dominate American elections to the degree that the greatest percentage of the vote that a Libertarian presidential candidate has received is just over 3%, which went to Gary Johnson in 2016. The Libertarian candidate for president in 2020, Joe Jorgensen, received just 1.2% of the vote. Taking a lesson from this, Mayer explains that the Kochs decided to keep their political influence at the funding level instead of running for office themselves. They began devoting their fortune to front groups that presented the government as the enemy of the people and believed that the purpose of the nation should be to enable private citizens to accrue immense wealth. Short-form note: in recent years, Charles Koch has expressed some regret over his heavily partisan participation in the political sphere. He's begun trying to reach across the aisle and appeal to liberals and Democrats on criminal justice reform and foreign affairs in order to bridge the ideological divide in America he feels he helped create. However, the vast majority of his political spending continues to go to Republican candidates. To this end, Charles Koch hired Richard Fink as his political advisor. According to Mayer, Fink laid out a specific plan consisting of 3 phases for taking over American politics. These 3 steps were 1. Invest in conservative intellectuals who could produce the ideas for the movement, 2. Invest in think tanks to market these ideas as policies, and 3. Create groups that supposedly represented the will of the people to pressure politicians to adopt the policies. Short-form note: some argue that the Trump presidency called into question the necessity of hiring political advisors like Richard Fink to win races or achieve political victories. Trump's campaign was highly unconventional, and his win defied the predictions of professional pollsters, making it seem that perhaps political success isn't contingent on having expert advisors. Still, it's unlikely that politicians will dispense with advisors, simply because the politicians are so eager to win. It seems more sensible and less risky to just hire an advisor, even though you can't truly know how helpful they'll be to your campaign. Phase 1: Produce conservative ideas. To carry out Phase 1, explains Mayer, the Kochs sought to establish a beachhead, or a program at a prestigious university that they could fill with conservative-minded faculty, and then grow into much larger programs. Such programs were given deliberately innocuous names to avoid the appearance of being ideologically driven. They did so at Virginia's George Mason University, where they established the think tank called the Institute for Humane Studies, a program aimed at building a new generation of libertarian scholars. The libertarian emphasis of the program was so heavy that at one point applicants' essays were scanned by computers for mentions of libertarian icons like Ayn Rand. This, as well as the funding of other far-right think tanks like the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation, created the intellectuals who would produce ideas for the libertarian movement. Short-form note: today, the Institute for Humane Studies continues to fund research supporting libertarian ideas, offering $2 million in grants for scholars as well as tens of thousands of dollars in fellowship grants. As part of their talent identification rubric, the program assesses potential applicants for their openness and sympathy to the ideas of classical liberalism which are comparable to libertarian beliefs, and notes this as their most essential measure for accepting applicants. Phase 2: Market conservative policies. For Phase 2, the Kochs established the Mercatus Center, also at George Mason University, which critics described as nothing more than a lobbying group. Conservative faculty members wrote drafts of bills for issues like supply-side tax cuts that were then passed on to legislators to introduce into Congress. According to Mayer, such programs led these previously far-right ideas to be taken seriously in politics, and to begin affecting legislation, just as Fink had planned. Short-form note: the Mercatus Center remains one of the country's most influential libertarian think tanks. Though it officially represents itself as a nonpartisan group that doesn't engage in lobbying, critics have noted that the group has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on trips for government officials and suggested that it should be required to register itself as a lobbying group. Funded by millions of dollars from Koch Industries, the center also provides money and benefits to conservative media figures such as Fox News contributor Larry Kudlow. Phase 3: Apply popular pressure to influence politicians. Finally, for Phase 3, Charles Koch established the non-profit educational group Citizens for a Sound Economy, which would act as a sales force to build public support for their libertarian ideology. This group had the appearance of a grassroots movement, but in reality it was funded by corporate sponsors, mainly the Kochs. Rather than being made up of average citizens fighting for what they believed in, Mayer writes, it was instead run by pro-capitalist businessmen who would use the group to promote their own interests. Over the next few decades, the Kochs repeated this pattern at hundreds of other universities and think tanks. Short-form note: in 2003 Citizens for a Sound Economy disbanded and split into 2 groups, Americans for Prosperity and Freedom Works. Freedom Works played a significant role in the fight against climate legislation and continues to downplay the impact of climate change, citing it as a woke political grab by the Democrats. This might be considered evidence that the group is indeed run by business people who don't want climate change legislation to hamper their money-making efforts. New section: Electoral Politics, Funding Candidates and Campaigns. Though they had previously been opposed to the Republican Party because it was too moderate, explains Mayer, the Kochs began donating heavily to Republican politicians in the 1980s and 1990s. They were among the top 3 financial backers of Bob Dole's campaign against Bill Clinton for the presidency in 1996, and in return, Dole promoted legislation that saved Koch Industries millions of dollars. Short-form note: the Kochs may have been spurred into their explicit support of the Republican Party by the Senate's investigation into Koch Industries for the theft of oil from Indian reservations. This investigation convinced Charles Koch that he had to get involved in Washington if he wanted to protect his company. Bob Dole helped the Kochs by submitting an article into the Senate record that included a quote from the chief of one of the involved Indian tribes saying, based on information presented to them by Koch Industries, that the company had not been stealing oil from them. This article damaged the Senate's case against the Kochs and further endeared Dole to the Kochs. They also funded vicious attack ads against Democrats in the 1996 election. According to Mayer, to conceal the money's origin, they funneled their money through the tax-exempt non-profit group, the Economic Education Trust, which then poured the money into a shell corporation called Triad Management Services that made the ads. It's suspected that the ads affected the outcomes of 4 races, which helped Republicans retain control of the House of Representatives. Short-form note: the Kochs' funding of attack ads may have had a greater effect than comparable funding from the Republican Party. Research suggests that attack ads funded by independent sources like the Economic Education Trust are more effective than attack ads funded by candidates against their opponents. Ads funded by candidates often receive backlash that independent groups are not subject to, and this may incentivize those independent groups to make more controversial and potentially less truthful ads. Over the next 2 decades, the Kochs continued to flood money into conservative politicians' campaigns, think tanks, and public interest groups in order to promote free market economics. The exact amount of dark money they spent is unknown, and the flexibility of laws exempting charities from taxes enabled them to have an immense monetary impact on electoral politics. Short-form note: Americans may be becoming increasingly opposed to the role of dark money in elections. A 2019 study showed widespread support for requiring political groups to disclose their donors, with less than 25% saying they shouldn't have to disclose the source of their funding. Additionally, a 2018 study indicated that most Americans favor putting limits on campaign spending because without them, the wealthy have a disproportionate influence on politics. New section: the election of Barack Obama and the Tea Party movement. According to Mayer, in the 2008 election, outside individuals and groups spent an unprecedented amount of money to influence the results. However, despite the Kochs and their donors' best efforts, Barack Obama was elected president. His platform promised to reduce income inequality by making the wealthy pay their fair share. The Kochs and other elites were highly disturbed by this, and were determined to undermine his presidency. Short-form note: the Kochs maintained a rocky relationship with President Obama throughout his presidency, particularly over climate change issues. In 2015, Obama singled out the Koch brothers as major contributors to climate change, accusing them of trying to keep clean energy businesses from succeeding by opposing subsidies for such businesses. This prompted a backlash from Charles Koch, who asserted that they're against government subsidies of all kinds, though he admitted his company benefits from them. However, they have occasionally aligned on other issues, such as criminal justice reform. Because he took office during a recession, explains Mayer, one of Obama's first pieces of legislation was a stimulus bill, which involved putting trillions of dollars of government money into the economy to pull it out of the recession. Immediately after Obama's inauguration, the Kochs' nonprofit advocacy group Americans for Prosperity began attacking his platform, organizing rallies and other events decrying public spending to undercut his proposed stimulus bill. Think tanks like the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation began publishing research papers and opinion pieces in opposition to the bill, sometimes based on incorrect facts that were nevertheless repeated by conservative media figures like Rush Limbaugh. Short-form note: the Heritage Foundation has maintained its anti-stimulus spending stance during the COVID-19 pandemic, citing the 2008 stimulus to suggest that stimulus spending is ineffective and costly. The Cato Institute has echoed this sentiment and painted stimulus checks as a political stunt. However, research from other groups suggests that the stimulus checks sent out during the pandemic resulted in the first major reduction of income inequality in a generation. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics predicts that income inequality will increase over the coming years absent further stimulus checks. According to Mayer, This unrest combined with the ideological movement fueled by the Kochs led to the creation of the Tea Party movement. The movement was partly a response to Obama's proposal in 2009 to help bail out homeowners facing foreclosure during the economic crisis. Those on the far right balked at this suggestion and claimed that people who were facing foreclosure had made bad decisions, and that others shouldn't have to help pay for them. Short-form note: libertarians and conservatives have been making similar arguments in recent years regarding the issue of student loan forgiveness, suggesting that it incentivizes government dependence, and that loan debt is the result of poor decision-making by students, a belief held disproportionately by older Americans. For these reasons, some groups have even brought lawsuits against President Biden's proposed debt relief plan. This sentiment that poverty is a personal failing, that people shouldn't be expected to help other people who are struggling, and that personal opportunity is more important than others' welfare define much of the Tea Party platform. The movement was painted as a widespread grassroots movement, but in reality it was engineered by outside money. Short-form note: while outside money was responsible for the creation of the Tea Party movement, some have argued that it is still a grassroots movement because of the widespread popular support it received due to existing beliefs among citizens. However, other research indicates that the Tea Party movement is largely out of line with public opinion, and that its influence on the GOP agenda is disproportionately large. Officials in Congress like Eric Cantor, Kevin McCarthy, and Pete Sessions formed a strategy of obstructionism designed to prevent any of Obama's platform from being enacted. This extreme wing of the party began pressuring more moderate members to support this obstructionism. These moderates now saw that if they didn't shift to the right, they would be ousted in primary races and replaced with extreme candidates funded by outside money. Short-form note: the strategy of obstructionism was extremely successful, but it may have backfired on the Republican Party as its leaders began to lose control of the movement. Eric Cantor ended up losing his seat in the House of Representatives in 2014 to a candidate who claimed Cantor wasn't conservative enough. In 2023, Kevin McCarthy won the position of Speaker of the House on the 15th ballot, but only after surrendering much of his power as Speaker to far-right candidates who were denying him the position. New section: Redistributing Power in the States, Citizens United and RedMap. Having heavily impaired Obama's power by undermining the bipartisan support he was expecting, the Kochs next went after power at the state level, explains Mayor. In 2010, the Supreme Court's ruling in the Citizens United case let wealthy donors and corporations have an even greater influence on politics by removing restrictions on the amount of money they could spend to influence elections. Critics predicted that the decision would result in a huge upswing in corporate political spending, but instead it enabled just a handful of extremely wealthy people to implement their personal agendas in the political sphere. Short-form note: some experts have suggested that the Citizens United case was not as consequential as many believe. They note that the amount of outside spending on elections was already increasing in the early 2000s and maintained a steady rate of increase before and after Citizens United. Some attribute this to the 2002 passage of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, suggesting that its limits on individual donations to political parties actually prompted a much greater inflow of dark money through independent groups despite its intended purpose of reducing outside influence on elections. Simultaneously, in 2011, many states were redrawing their districts as they did once a decade. A political tactician named Ed Gillespie created a plan to redraw districts to disproportionately benefit Republicans, a plan they called RedMap. They used North Carolina as a guinea pig for this experiment, explains Mayor, and they redrew the district lines to concentrate Democratic voters into a few districts and left the rest of the map mostly Republican. Short-form note: the fact that the drawing of district lines is performed by elected officials in a majority of states has drawn some criticism, with some recommending that lines should be drawn by independent groups whose members cannot run for office for a few years before and after serving on the commission. They also recommend that the public should be able to submit proposals for districting to ensure that they're representative of the will of the people. Currently, only 4 states use independent groups to draw district lines. In 2012, with the RedMap plan and the spending power granted by Citizens United, Republicans successfully turned the swing state red, both at the state and national level. Though the Republican Party received fewer votes than Democrats in North Carolina and other states the plan targeted, they won more seats in Congress, allowing Republicans to maintain their majority in the House of Representatives. A lawsuit filed by progressives against the new district maps was killed by the state's majority Republican Supreme Court. The pattern was repeated across the nation, giving Republicans control over both the legislatures and governorships in over 20 states and turning other previously swing states like Michigan and Ohio red. Short-form note: while the effects of partisan redistricting are lasting, experts note that changes in population will lessen their impact over the decade before the next redistricting. Additionally, in 2017, the Supreme Court ruled that the gerrymandering of 2 districts in North Carolina was unconstitutional and was designed to limit the power of black voters in the state. New section: Obama's 2012 re-election and its aftermath, retooling the conservative approach. By 2012, the Kochs had undermined Obama's administration and created a cultural push in the Republican Party towards far-right ideology. According to Mayer, they expected Republicans to beat Obama by a landslide in the 2012 election, but were astonished when he was re-elected. They had done well in the states, but Mitt Romney had proven to be too weak a candidate to beat President Obama despite the $2.5 billion spent against him. Short-form note: some attribute Romney's loss less to his weakness as a candidate and more to other circumstantial factors. They suggest that Obama only won in 2008 because of the financial crisis, and that his response to Hurricane Sandy helped him win in 2012. Others say Romney would have done better with a different running mate, and that he should have chosen someone like Marco Rubio or Bob McDonnell instead of Paul Ryan. According to Mayer, the Kochs and other conservatives set about understanding their 2012 loss and what to do differently next time. Based on research from their think tanks, they realized that much of the issue was that people viewed the Republican Party as lacking in empathy for the poor and for average citizens. Most people believed that free market policies disproportionately benefited the rich. The Kochs began funding a campaign to change Republicans' public image to make them seem like they were working to protect American citizens, and not just their own wealth, though in private conversations, they admitted that personal profit was their only goal. Short-form note: it's unclear whether the rebranding of the Republican Party was successful. Polling 1 year after the 2012 election showed that a majority of people felt either that the Republican Party had made no significant changes or that it had moved further away from representing their interests. Continued polling showed the Republican Party's approval rating remaining around 35 to 45% in the years following, though it dipped as low as 28% in 2013 and as high as 51% in early 2020. For both parties, polling seems to indicate a declining approval rate over the past 30 years. Mayer writes that the Kochs began rebranding themselves publicly to convince people they were concerned with the well-being of average citizens. They made a show of public donations to groups like the United Negro College Fund, and they continued to target academia through the hundreds of programs they were funding at universities across the country. They also began targeting high school students through a non-profit organization called the Young Entrepreneurs Academy that provided desperately needed funding to schools. That program then taught students that, for instance, it's okay to pay women less than men for the same work, and that progressive policies are harmful to the poor and cause economic recessions. Short-form note: in a 2016 article in The New Yorker, Mayer discusses the success of the Kochs rebranding. She notes that they supplemented their philanthropic efforts and conservative educational programs with television ads that depicted them as regular people with deep American roots to make them seem more relatable. They also changed up their decades-long strategy of keeping their public activities secret and began courting the media to improve how they were portrayed. In 2018, Charles Koch announced to his network that they would begin publicizing their contributions to universities, and some Democrats have noted that their rebranding has been at least somewhat successful and that it placed them behind Donald Trump as the main enemy of the left. Additionally, says Mayer, the Kochs decided to retool the Republican Party, blaming its infrastructure for their 2012 loss. Now, even Republicans who had been touting these free market ideals found their positions jeopardized by wealthy donors threatening to fund and replace them with more extreme candidates. Short-form note: dark money can be even more effective in curating party nominees than determining the results of general elections. Because the turnout for primary elections tends to be so low, it's often easy for small, well-funded groups to elect the candidates of their choice. The Koch's efforts proved fruitful in the 2014 election, when the Republicans managed to win both houses of Congress. It was the largest amount of outside money ever spent on a midterm election. From then on, explains Mayer, their goal was to obstruct every facet of Obama's agenda, and to undo everything he'd accomplished in the previous 6 years. Short-form note: in response to the attacks on his agenda, President Obama began to embrace his executive power. Though aware of the lack of cooperation he'd be receiving from Congress, he declared 2014 a year of action, and began enacting more regulations through executive order. Newly elected officials like Mitch McConnell began carrying out attacks on progressive legislation and agencies like the EPA. Republicans shifted further right or were replaced with far-right officials. The Kochs had effectively achieved their decades-long goal of making libertarianism mainstream and controlling the government in a way no private citizens ever had before. Nevertheless, Mayer explains, Charles Koch maintained that he was a disinterested party only looking to increase the well-being of the nation. Short-form note: while the Kochs have had a massive influence on politics, David passed away in 2019, and Charles is already 87, which raises the question: will they continue to have a massive influence on politics? Charles's son Chase has taken over David's role in the company and made plans to move away from the political sphere in favor of advancing libertarian principles and issues of social justice, suggesting the Koch's fortune in the near future might no longer go to supporting political candidates or policies. Charles has said he doesn't know who his successor will be, but that they will be selected by the board after his death. New section: the 2016 surprise, the election of Donald Trump. In 2016, the Kochs weren't backing any presidential candidate, but were focusing on maintaining their hold on both houses of Congress and further cementing their hold on governments at the state and local levels, which they accomplished. According to Mayer, they were surprised by the nomination of Donald Trump, who gained popularity by painting himself as a self-made billionaire who, unlike his opponent Hillary Clinton, was not reliant on other people's wealth. Leading up to the election, the Kochs seemed to oppose him, but after his victory, Trump put together a transition team full of corporate lobbyists, many of whom had ties to the Kochs. Mayer notes that though Trump had won on the claim that he would drain the swamp or rid the government of individuals who were devoted only to enhancing their wealth, he immediately began adding such individuals, appointing people to positions of power in which they could pursue personal financial interests. As a whole, Mayer explains, the Trump administration began implementing policies that aligned closely with the Kochs' ideals, promoting fossil fuels, decreasing government regulations, and promising to dismantle the EPA, among other things. Though it remained unclear how much direct influence the Kochs would be able to wield over Trump, what was clear was that their wealth would continue to have a heavy influence on the nation's politics for the foreseeable future even after the Kochs' deaths, as directed in their wills. Radicalism gone wild. Did the Kochs help elect President Trump? The Kochs weren't the only ones surprised by Donald Trump's 2016 victory, as polls leading up to the election favored a strong win by Hillary Clinton. There are many theories as to what led to his win, including the idea that Clinton's lead in the polls caused some citizens to not bother to vote because they assumed she'd win easily. Others have suggested it was because neither Clinton nor Trump was an appealing candidate to most people, noting that third-party votes in 2016 were triple what they were in 2012. Charles Koch himself likened the choice between the candidates to a choice between cancer and a heart attack. Some experts also suggest that Trump won by capitalizing on the momentum of the Tea Party movement, by promoting fake news and misinformation, and by tapping into fringe conspiracy beliefs like those of the birther movement, the movement fueled by false claims that Obama was born in Kenya and wasn't a U.S. citizen. By fomenting the Tea Party movement, legitimizing fringe beliefs, and creating a massive influx of disinformation, the Kochs may have helped secure Trump's 2016 win. Moreover, after he took office, the Koch operatives that he began filling his administration with discovered that he was highly impressionable, and that they were able to shape much of his agenda to suit their interests. Still, the Kochs and Trump continued to clash over issues like government spending and small government policies.